All yours, Moshe. Thanks.
Hi, thank you very much for this nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the most recent work in my lab, which is really a theoretical framework that is a synthesis of many areas and several observations that we and the literature have accumulated over the years. So we call it overarching states of mind, and I'm going to unpack it gradually. So the quick overview of my talk is that I'll be first talking about covariances that we noticed over the years between things that happen in perception, in attention, in thought, in behavior, and in mood. And then I'll be talking about how they're all tied together, all these big pillars of mental studies and psychology and neuroscience, how they actually are tied together in a structure that we call the overarching state of mind. And then we'll propose the unifying mechanism for state of mind, how our state of minds are accomplished, globally speaking, and very speculatively at this stage. We don't necessarily have a very concrete mechanism now, but it's more a principle than a mechanism. And then show how this mechanism and this principle explains states of minds and the way that they co-vary, and then discuss implications. So let me start. Think about major dimensions that we study about the brain. I realize that many of you are computer scientists and AI researchers, and I think this information here doesn't require a specific jargon, a specific background in neuroscience per se, but feel free to stop me at any time if you feel like you need more clarifications. It's important for me that you understand what I'm saying. So perception, even if you take it as one thing, actually can be shaped by incoming information, by the senses, right? By the actual physical world around us, or it can also be shaped by predictions, by memory, by things that we already know. So we can perceive the world as really as it is, as some philosophers have been talking about it, or it can be shaped or at least framed in a way that is also relying on predictions of things that we already know and expect to see or to hear or whatever senses we're talking about. Same, we can talk about attention. Attention can be allocated locally to features, more analytical features, more details in the world around us, or it can be more global. We can be attending the trees or the forest, right? So we're all familiar with the idea that both perceptions can vary and attention, scope of attention can vary. So it's not like a mixed faculty or a single process or a single faculty with the same characteristic. They can vary. So in the case of perception, I was talking about to what extent it is bottom-up, it's shaped by the senses, or to what extent it's top-down by predictions. Attention similarly can be local or global. And moving on, thinking about thought, right? So our thought can be narrow. We can be focusing on something very specific, and we can circle around it. I'll talk a little bit about mood and depression. So there we talk about ruminations, there's a cyclical type of thinking that is very narrow versus, it doesn't have to be clinical, by the way. We can also be very focused in trying to solve a problem, and we just remain within the same niche or semantic territory. Or our mind can be very broad and associative in the sense that it jumps from one topic to another in a coherent manner, but still it expands, right? So it's associatively expanding. We can also vary in the extent to which we're open to new experience. We call it sometimes exploitation and exploration. You guys may be familiar with it, but the idea here is really that if you look at tolerance for uncertainty, we as individuals can be in some circumstances more open to new experiences, to thrill, to taking risks in order to learn because we're curious, etc. Or we can be exploitatory. We can exploit the familiar. We can lean on things that are already, we know that they're safe, we know that they're comfortable, we know that they're good for us, and we just don't, we resort to this. So these are states, like in all the others, like in perception and attention and thought. These are states. I'm not saying that we're only exploitatory or only exploratory. The idea here is that it's a continuum, right? So all these major dimensions that have provided major topics of research, communities, etc., each one of them has the same characteristic of being a continuum and changing along a certain dimension. And the same we can say also about mood and affect. It can be negative, it can be positive, it can be anywhere in between. Okay, so now we realize, I just set the ground here, that all these major pillars of our mental life actually are not fixed, but rather can vary between wide and narrow, positive and negative, local or global, more input, more memory. Memory is the top-down stuff, the predictions. So giving it some sort of graphic predictions, depiction, you can look at all these dimensions that I just mentioned: perception, attention, thought, openness to experience, and affect. And as I said, they're all continuous, right? So this is just repeating what I just said, that it can range, each one of them can range from one end to the other. It can be relying more on sensory than on prediction, global, local, etc. Okay. So what we notice over the years research in my lab and then also in the literature is that many of these aspects actually change together. I can go back to this and I tell you that in my own lab, we noticed that hey, the way you think affects how you feel, right? So people also in social psychology and other types of psychological research have established that if you're in good mood, you think in a more associative, creative manner. If you're in a bad mood, you're more narrowly thinking. We do the other way in my lab. We actually change the way you think, if it's a broad or narrow, and see how it affects your mood. But here are two topics that I never dreamt before are related, but actually the way you think, how broad is your thinking scope, actually affects your mood and vice versa. And gradually we started to see more and more relations between these dimensions that previously, especially as a graduate student and a young faculty, you think that they are independent, right? In the brain has all this heavy machinery for each one of them, and sometimes they interact, but they are independent territories. What I'm saying today here is this is not the case, and actually they're tied together. And these interdependencies actually reflect a bigger topic here, or a more overarching issue here. Okay, so they change together in a sense that when perception is more geared or oriented towards sensory information, to bottom-up information, attention would also tend to be more global than local. So far, it's a hypothesis. Okay, so bear with me. I'll show you some evidence, and in our recent publications, there's way more references for this. So when perception is more oriented towards sensory information, attention is also more attuned to global features of our environment. Thought, our thinking pattern tends to be more broad. Our openness to experience, we tend to be more exploratory, creative, curious, more less risk averse, higher tolerance for uncertainty, and mood tends to be more positive. And critically, if you change any of this, that's the proposal here, if you change any of this in this direction, if you make perception rely more on predictions, or if you make attention be more local than global, or thought more narrow than broad, etc., you move all the other dimensions as well. Okay, so let me turn the. So the idea here is that these things that previously have been studied in isolation actually are related and change together. And the argument continues to say that it's not coincidental that they move together. Actually, they move together because they're tied together. All these big issues, these big topics or big processes actually move together because they're tied together. They cannot not move together, okay? So they're really tied together by this overarching state of mind entity that we're talking about and elaborate on here. So the state of mind is overarching because you can imagine it's like a web that is cast over your entire cortex, and it ties together perception, attention, thought, affect, behavior, memory, language, planning, control, motivation. The list can go on and on and on. And the idea here is that your state determines the set of your dispositions, the set of your biases, the set of your tendencies in all these domains, in So your entire brain is oriented towards being more this or more that, okay? And this affects all these things that, again, were previously studied alone. So if your perception is broader, your attention is broader, your thought is broader, your affect is more positive, your behavior is more risk or thrill-seeking, etc. Okay, so that's the claim here, that all these things are tied together because there's this bigger entity, the state of mind, that's overarching and dictates how we perceive, think, and behave based on this state of mind. And this state of mind in these extremes, as I showed, can be either broad or narrow, open or closed. You can call it open and closed. Okay, so these extremes, oops, what happened here? Something just closed. Oh. Okay, so I was just here. Sorry about that. Okay, so how open or how close you are, how broad or how narrow you are, determines all these proclivities and how you behave in each of these domains. So I hope it makes sense. We call the left side broad because it's broad attention, broad thinking. You're more exploratory. You're exploring your environment and less tending to resort to the familiar. You're censoring from, you're open more to the senses rather than to your very limiting predictions and relying on them. Now, two things are important to highlight in here. One is that one is rarely in either extreme. So it's not like you're either very broad or very narrow. This is a continuum. It can be, and I think most of us, most of the day, are anywhere in between, okay? So your perception is some kind of a mixture between using the actual sensory information, the physical information coming from the senses about the world, mixed in with some predictions, with some knowledge, with some anticipations, with some fears and desires, whatever, but some other things flavor your perception. Okay, so it's a mixture. And attention is never or rarely completely global, your entire scene, and it's or never completely local, or rarely very local. It's like 1 millimeter resolution. So all these things change. We have to remember that they change, and they change based on several factors that some of them I can maybe list today. But the idea here is that this is changing, okay, changes together, and most of us, unless we're talking about some clinical disorders, most of us are anywhere in between, and we slide up and down this continuum. The second thing is that regardless of what I might be seem to say, there's no good or bad state of mind. Okay, so there's nothing bad about being exploitatory and resorting to things that make you feel safe and enjoy the familiar. Okay, and similarly, there's nothing heroic or interesting about being completely explorer and then taking risks and all these things. The claim here at the end of this talk, or at the end of the paper, and what you're saying overall at the end, is that our state of mind has to fit the specific circumstances. It has to fit our goals, what we need to accomplish, and it needs to fit where we are and what's best for us. So in some cases, it's good to be an explorer. In some cases, it's good to be an exploiter. In some cases, you want to examine your environment in a broad attention spotlight. And in some cases, you want to be narrow. In some cases, it's good to be focused in your thoughts, and others, you want to be open. So there's no judgment here. There's no good or bad, and there is no fixed state of mind. What I want you to take from this long intro is that all these big dimensions are continuums, and they are tied together, and they move based on different parameters, and I'll delve deeper into it later on. But the idea here is that they're clustered together, and that's the first thing that I want you to take from this. So maybe there's a question now, or I can continue. I can't see the chat, so if there is...
Moshe, one quick question.
Yeah.
So generally, in perception, we would consider sensory information, but you also consider prediction or simulations in perception.
Right. So I don't consider prediction as perception, even though, you know, the Helmholtz, the Bayesian framework think that prediction is perception and that the perception is inference. That's not what I'm claiming here. What I'm saying here is that prediction can affect the way you perceive. Okay, I'll give you an example. So in a study from the 70s, Steve Palmer from Berkeley, when he was a graduate student, showed people objects or scenes and put objects in them and asked people to identify individual objects. Okay, so imagine a kitchen scene and there is a cutting board on the counter and three groups of subjects. One group saw a loaf of bread on the cutting board. Okay, another group saw a drum. Okay, and a third group saw a mailbox. Okay, so the people that saw the bread said loaf of bread. The people who saw the drum said drum because it was sufficiently different than a loaf of bread. But many people who saw the mailbox, you know, the typical mailbox, also said a loaf of bread. Okay, their expectations tainted or distorted what they actually perceived. So even though it's not a loaf of bread, they expected it and it was sufficiently similar in, you know, maybe in the low spatial frequencies, as I like to suggest, then prediction can actually interfere with perception. Sometimes it's facilitating, sometimes it's distorting, but it's a facilitation, or it's an involvement or part of the mix. Okay.
I see. So if it is okay, I can put it like I can connect it very nicely with the scope of thought, which is associative thinking style, right?
Yeah. Same there. You know, so exactly. Yeah.
If there are any other question, you can unmute yourself and ask at this moment.
Okay, anytime you can just stop and
Yeah.
ask. It's not a question, not a problem. Okay, so people have talked about it in the past about some types of states or structures that are reminiscent of what we're suggesting, and not that, obviously not exactly the same, but things that are close enough to make us comfortable about this. When I was a young scientist, my director, when I was still at Harvard, my director told me that if your new theory, new idea has nothing related in the literature, you're probably a cuckoo. You know, you're probably dreaming some lunatic, and there's no truth to it. So a good theory, you have to be able to find some roots in the literature, so it's close enough to other things that have been said, but still novel. So in clinical psychology, there is a concept called multiple self states that are different versions of the self that arise in different contexts. In cognitive psychology and mindset, there's a concept called mindset, describes the configuration of processing resources available for subsequent tasks. And again, in the actual paper that I'll show you before, the first paper that we described about it, or where we describe this framework, you'll see all these references and more. In educational psychology, there's something that they call mindsets also, that they conceptualize as the beliefs one holds regarding his personal abilities, which can hamper or foster performance. So if you think you're good at math, it can affect how you perform, etc. And all those different accounts acknowledge that the mind is a dynamic construct that can change according to context. Okay, so the circumstances can affect how your mind is oriented. And here we say that it is overarching because it really encompasses everything I could think of in the world of cognition, but also that they change together. In the world of neuroscience, people also have been studying states to some extent. So here's people in a group of Mike Posner talking about different stages in sleep and concentration and Hefford, and can they find what happened, what brain structures are associated with the different states. It's actually a big study, and they kind of mapped states, resting states, alert state, and meditation state, rest with EEG and other methods. More recently, Steven and I used fMRI, MEG, and hidden Markov models to discover different brain states. So think about you putting somebody in the magnet in MRI, and you scan their brain. You don't give them any task, and you just want to understand what state are they in. Are they alert? Are they sleepy? Are they happy? Are they sad? Do they think wide? Do they think narrow? Of course, we're not there yet, but these guys actually try to infer how wakeful or how awake the person is based on extracting all these sophisticated measures for there. And they managed to do this, to kind of characterize based on cortical activity, the state of the person, okay? And this is a study I really like that was sophisticated in asking, are these things that we find and we think about, are they states or are they different modes of the same, so other modules or others of these states, okay? So if in this case it's an animal, liking, wanting, fear, and disgust, different states, okay? And they find activation in different places. Are these like individual modules that this one is a module responsible for liking, this one is for wanting, this is for fear, etc.? Or are they activated differently because they kind of together with their combined activation reflect the state the animal is in. Okay, and they, from this paper that you can read, they concluded that it was modes and not modules, supporting our ideas that there's modes. Okay. So now let me just go a little deeper. It won't be too deep, but a little deeper into what we talk about when we talk about states. So think about broad and narrow, and let's start with perception. So this is following up on your question that perception can be more based on bottom-up information. Okay, that's the sensory information coming from the senses to our brain, or top-down. It could be influenced by things we already know or anticipate or are alert of or expecting or whatever. So there's this stream and this stream, right? The bottom up and the top down. And they're mixed together usually. In our everyday perception, it's a mixture of both. And if you're in a new environment where you cannot make predictions, then your top-down information is useless, if there is any, because you don't have previous experience. You cannot generate any expectation that can aid perception. So in this case, perception will be bottom-up. If you're in an immensely familiar environment, then top-down will rule, like in the kitchen example I gave. Okay? So that's about perception being more based on memory, on prediction, versus on sensory information. Now about attention. So attention, as I said, and as I'm sure you already know, can be more global in terms of attending the forest versus more local. So in this Navon figures, that's a paradigm that asks people to say the shape they see here or the letter. So if they think globally, they see the S here. If they think locally or they attend locally, they see the F, and same about the squares and the circles. Okay, so attention, I'm just demonstrating again the idea that there are different states for each one of these dimensions. Okay, so, okay, let me skip that. Thought can be more associative or more ruminative. As I said, we can be thinking very broadly, jump from one topic to another, not in an incoherent manner. This is not, I'm not talking about clinical or mental disorders, but just in generally, we can be associative. You can imagine if you have hard time thinking about associative thought, a good analogy is think about having a dinner gathering with your friends around the table. So there's a conversation going on and you start talking about, I don't know, ice cream, and then people talk about cholesterol, and then people talk about their exams, and then people talk about health insurance, and then people talk about the upcoming elections. So you move from one topic to another seamlessly, but you're moving, right? You're progressing and it's advanced. Versus rumination, where you're stuck on a similar topic and you just go over and over. And the idea here is that there's a secret ingredient or a cool ingredient that people often forget about, and that's inhibition. What's the role of inhibition in controlling, in this case, our thought? It actually affects more than our thought, much more. It's a very critical and central element in our brain. But in the context of thought, let's think for a second about inhibition, how it affects the way we think. So if this is your brain representation of a coffee cup, right? So when you see a coffee cup, you activate this representation. But from your experience, the associations in your memory, this coffee cup is connected to coffee beans, to donut, to coffee maker, to sugar, to other kind of cups, etc. Right? each one of these associates is also connected to other things, right? So we have one, I don't have to convince you of that. We have one big semantic associative net, and all our memory is connected. All the things we know connect to each other with some degrees of separation, but they're all connected. There's no floating item in our memory, or else we won't be able to approach it or to access it. But the thing is that when you actually see or think about a coffee cup, you don't want this beach umbrella to be activated, right? It's associated, but not too associated. You want to activate predictions and associations that are helpful and relevant in a specific context. So we need some inhibition, not too much and not too little, right? Because when there's too much or too little, then we start talking about mental illness. But basically, in the most typical everyday circumstances, we need to activate associations. We can't just activate the object itself. We can't help by activate associate. But we don't want to go too far, because you probably, each one of us has experience where you come up with a very remote association and your friends look at you like you're crazy because how do you get to this association, right? So because sometimes we have our own individual shortcuts. So basically inhibition helps monitor how much we have from this inhibition, from this activation. So a normal inhibition, top-down inhibition, helps you, it gives you some room for activations. You do have to be associative, right? But it does also limit the scope of your activation, so you're not delusional in the activations, but rather you focus on what's relevant. In cases of depression, that's a reference for a paper that we talked about depression. In those cases where rumination is a hallmark symptom of depression, there's hyperinhibition. There's too much inhibition, and this limits how broad you can be with your thoughts, okay? So we're not going to discuss depression too much here, but the idea here is that that an abnormal level of rumination can give rise to some disorder. Some of them are associated with a narrow scope of thought. Okay, so mood, and this relates still to mood. The hypothesis that emerged from this thought about inhibition and breadth of association is that mood is directly linked to how associative or how inhibited are our mental processes, okay? So the breadth of your thought affects your mood. Of course, there are other things that affect your mood, and it doesn't have to be only thought, but here is a strong relationship, and it's bidirectional. Your breadth of thought can affect your mood, and your mood can affect your breadth of thought, okay? And this is what, as I mentioned and pointed out at the very beginning, this was one dependency that made me go, why are they connected? This is thinking, this is mood. Mood seems like it's coming from a different world than the more cerebral thought. But there it is. We find on and on, over and over, and also other labs since, we find this direct connection between how you feel and how you think. And this is just a different rendition of what I showed you before, that when there's too much inhibition, there's ruminative thinking and not enough expansion of the associative thought. Okay, openness to experience. So as I said before, there's exploration and exploitation, and they really differ in the extent to which one is tolerant to uncertainty. How much uncertainty you can stomach. If you're open to uncertainty, then you're open to explore. You can learn more, you can experience more, but there's also higher risk. You can die more often, okay? But in exploitation, it's much safer. You lean on years of experience and things you already know. So this is cool, it's safe, but then might be boring because you don't learn anything new, you don't experience anything new, it's the same thing over and over. So exploration and exploitation depend on how certain you are and how much, not how much certain you are, but rather how willing you are to absorb uncertainty or to face uncertainty. So the covariances that I mentioned and we've seen in the past, and again elaborate in the paper, is between mood and association, attention and perception. You perceive broadly, you also attend broadly, exploration, curiosity, exploration and curiosity, thought and perception, approach and avoid, exploration and mood and association. All these dimensions of these cross dependencies. Okay. And this is the paper, and you can find it online, where the first paper we talked about this framework. You can see a more coherent description and a much richer set of references. So the idea here, as I said before, that not only do they change together, what's very powerful here, especially in the applicable world, is that you can change one in order to change the other. If somebody is feeling down, you can't just tell them, oh, be happier, right? But maybe if you can change the breadth of their thought or the scope of their attention, you actually can help with the dimensions or with the symptoms of mood. And similarly, if you want somebody to be more creative, if you're a big boss and you have a group of people and you want to brainstorm and generate some creative ideas, you want to know if they're now in a happy mood or good, a bad mood. Are they more exploratory, more exploitatory, or do they think globally or locally? If you take into account these states, you can optimize performance, your own and people that are around you, and improve your experience and just your well-being overall. So the idea here is that you can modulate. Some of these are changing spontaneously in our environment, right? So let's say you were very ruminative and thinking locally and more exploitatory, and you get a phone call and you just won the Oscar, right? And then you feel very happy and everything changes. So this is amazing, that how you feel can influence how you perform in things that seem unrelated. So we have people come to the lab and participate in all these behavioral experiments, right? So let's say you have people judge the size of things, or let's say that you ask give them some memory experiments, or even perception and attention and resolution of attention. We don't usually measure what's their state before they come into the lab, right? And somebody who just flanked a test, or somebody who just won the lottery, would perform very differently in the same experiment. And can we really make conclusions without taking actually their state into account? So the state, as I said, is based on context and the situation. Okay, so it could be the good news on the phone, it could be the company you're with, it could be many other things. But it's your mind is not fixed. Your mind is changing. The state of your mind changes depending on circumstances, and with it, you change all these big items such as perception and thought and all these things that I've listed here. These changes of the states can be driven externally or internally. They can originate from something from the outside, like you could be very local in your attention, examining little trees, but then there is a shriek somewhere or an explosion or somebody yelling your name. Then it expands your attention, and now you're actually seeing things differently. And this is my daughter here. So. These changes can be driven by the output, by our external world, but they also can be driven internally, or be originated internally by thoughts and by things that you remember and suddenly change your mood or whatever. So as I said before, when I talked about the experiments and how we treat our individual subjects, so you think about people study how we perceive saliency, how we prioritize our environment. How do you scan and use scene? You enter a new place. How do you scan and use scene? Okay, where do your eyes move next? What determines how you consume your environment and how you behave in this environment? So thinking about and developing these heavy models about how the brain generates priority maps has to take into account your state, because if you come in a very exploitatory, you feel intimidated, you just want to resort back to your room, and you're completely exploitatory, right? Your priorities are different. Where's the way back home? Where's the key to my door? And that's it, right? Whereas if you come to the same environment in a very exploratory manner, it's like, oh, forget about home. I want to learn something new. What's happening here in the street? What is this noise? What is this smell, right? You're more open. And this happens especially in new environments. Last year, I was in India. I went to Varanasi, and this is very, very different than anything I know, and I had an amazing experience. But imagine if I were exploitatory. There's like, oh, this is too different than what I know. I just want to just hide in my hotel room until I go to the next city, right? Then I would have missed a big experience. So when you travel, when you're ready for this new experience, you're more exploratory and you examine your environment very differently, and your priority map will be different. Okay, so there's a there's big difference between how we perceive, how we attend, how we think based on context. So our implicit assumption or implicit belief that our mind is the same, you know, I'm a good creative, I tend to take risks and blah, blah, changes based on context. This is, I'll talk about personality just in a second. Okay, so I talked about this, and this is related to Varanasi and other new experiences, that sometimes novelty, when you're in exploitatory mode, novelty or prediction error, you all know probably what's prediction error, right? So this loop of predictive coding. So if there is a big prediction error, there's a big difference between what you expect and what you perceive. If you're in a mode of exploitation, if your state of mind is highly exploitatory, this difference between what you expect and what you perceive would result in anxiety. Oh my God, what is going on? This is very different than what I anticipated. Okay? And whereas if you're in a state of exploration, you see something different than what you know, there's a big thrill, right? So it's the same signal, but depending on your state, it results in a different feeling, right? Anxiety versus thrill, how different it is for our experience, right? Thrill in a roller coaster, anxiety, you just want to hide somewhere. It's a completely different experience for the same signal, and it all depends on what state you're in. So the same individual, as I said, we're all different, but also within ourselves we're different, depending on circumstances. So the same individual can exhibit substantial changes when tested under different states. Okay, so an individual can be in a happy mood, or an individual in a happy mood will tend to have a broad associative thinking style, broader attentional scope, and inclined towards exploring her environment. This is the broad state of mind. While under negative mood will tend to be more rigid thinking style, narrowed attentional scope, and rely on exploiting familiar information and habitual behaviors. I hope this makes sense, but I also want to stress, because I talked about mood too much here, and also the phrasing here kind of gives a privileged status to mood. But remember what I said here before, that each one of these items can change the other. So I could have phrased this: an individual in a broad attentional scope will also have a broader thinking style, a happy mood. So each one of these parameters can change with the others. That's important. It's not like mood steers everything else, even though it sometimes seems like it, but rather they're all tied together. So what's the mechanism? What makes us more more open or more closed, more broad or more narrow? So our proposal is that the mechanism is the state of mind is determined by the balance between top-down and bottom-up processes. Okay? So I'll let you digest this for a second. And the idea here is that your state is determined by how much you take bottom-up information into account versus top-down. As I said before, I said it more explicitly in the context of perception, but the idea here is that in each of these domains, attention, association, or anything else, the state depends on how much you take top-down signals into account and bottom-up signals. You can think about the brain. There's no proof for this. It's a good intuition, but it might be an approximation. But basically, our brain always has, or most cases in our everyday normal life, has bottom-up signals. We always sense something, but we also have top-down signals. We always expect something. That's what they try to do in meditation, all this, just to suspend all this expectation. Just drop everything that you know that you're expecting, that you're judging, but just let the world come to you. Right? This means like just bottom up. So it's not talk about meditation. I can talk about it a little bit afterwards. But the idea here is that in every typical situation in everyday life, there is a mixture of how much we take bottom up and top down. This mixture, this ratio changes. Okay, and our proposal is that state of mind depends on this ratio of how much we take top down versus how much we take bottom up. Say it's a zero-sum game. What's the components of this mixture in your brain right now? How much top down versus how much bottom up? How much you operate on your expectations versus on the senses? Okay. So this is the proposed mechanism, and I'll talk a little more about this later, that this ratio can be modulated by inhibition, as I showed you, that you can open or close the expanse of your thoughts. Some weights, can you assign different weights to different bottom-up signals, different top-down signals? When you're in exploratory mode, you turn off top-down deliberately, you give them smaller weights and bigger weights to the input, to the bottom-up, because you're exploratory, and you change these weights when you're exploitatory, and you give more weight to the bottom-up, to your familiar information than top-down. So there are ways of changing it. So basically, keep building this figure here. So the broad state of mind is associated with a ratio of giving more weight to bottom-up information, right? So this is more sensory, more global, more broad association, more exploratory, and more positive mood. And in the other extreme, remember, we don't claim you're ever really in any extreme, but when you're gravitating more towards the top-down extreme of more top-down than bottom-up, then you're more relying on predictions and local information, error associations, etc. Okay, so not only the top-down, this ratio determines a state of mind. This is state of mind. This is how we need to look at state of mind. So that's another way of drawing this, that in a broad state of mind, we give more weights to the incoming information from sensory information and smaller weights coming from bottom-up information. And when we are in a narrower state of mind, we give more information to our previous knowledge, to our familiarity, to our expectations, and we let them determine more our perception, attention, the mixture. So these are different mixtures depending on the ratio. Okay, and in this specific alternative, it's determined by different weights, but this is not the only mechanism you can envision. But what I want you to keep in mind is the principle that we're proposing here, that your state really depends on how much you take into account bottom-up versus top-down information. Okay, so I'm not sure how much time I have. I can go. Can you tell me how much more time I have?
We have 15 minutes.
Okay. So possible elements of this top-down mechanism. So as I said before, it could be weights. Different weights change your state of mind. It could be the important balance between inhibition and excitation. Okay, and this is very important to know overall about the brain, regardless of our own framework here. I tend to give examples that somehow tend to be more about speed. So like, fighter planes or motorcycles, they usually start with a lot of power, and what you have to do as the pilot or somebody who steers it, you actually have to prune and you have to control, you have to inhibit. Most of what you do in controlling is actually inhibited. By default, there's a lot of excitation, and then you need to inhibit. So inhibition plays a huge role in our mental life, and without this balance, we'll be mentally ill in one way or another, okay? So the brain continuously fights in this balance, and I think that this balance can also affect these weights or these changes of state of mind. There's also neuromodulators that can definitely affect, and some people in the past talked about it a little bit, can affect our state. Neurosynchrony, other than changing state, neurosynchrony could be the mechanism. It's probably the most likely candidate for the mechanism that ties everything together. As I said, this is like a web that casts over our cortex, and something that kind of synchronizes this is this type of neurosynchrony that's been studied extensively. And the internal and external triggers are things that also both change and help change and help tie together all these elements. Okay, so these are a bit, I'm going to be, I don't want to be too redundant here. So I think a few things here I already said before, so I can just move faster here. So here we try to explain or to try to demonstrate how this principle of top-down and bottom-up actually affects. So when there's more weight to top-down, perception is more based on predictions. And when there is more top-down, or when top-down versus bottom-up is more towards the top-down, then we have more attentional signals. So we survey our environment in a more constricted manner, because our top-down tells us scan your environment in small spotlights rather than be completely open, right? So More top-down is more guidance is more inhibition, and more constriction. Similarly about thoughts, so when you're more oriented to the top-down, then you listen more carefully to the top-down inhibition, right? You take them into account, and this inhibition constrict the breadth of your thought, how much you open to experience and effect and affect. Okay, so one thing I want to say is that when you discuss these topics, you can't help thinking about personality. So if I'm a thrill seeker, I'm a thrill seeker. You told me here that there is a state and things are moving. So I'm not denying there's such thing as personality, even though the people in psychology are questioning more and more. But the idea here is that I have to reveal my background as an electrical engineer. So I have to say that the first thing I thought about was the AM radio, where you think about, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but the bigger signal is the envelope, right? So this is your personality, okay? Personality is the big fluctuations, that what are the big inclinations. But within the framework or within the envelope of your personality, there's modulation. This is the state of mind, the changing you to be closer to this or closer to that, okay? And this is interesting because in personality research, there's like Big Five. It's the most famous test for personality. And one of them is how open you are to experience. So imagine you're a student or you're applying to some job, or in Israel here you go to the army and they want to study how risk averse you are, and they want to see how open you are to new experiences, right? If you don't take this person's state of mind into account, you might just you might have just caught them in a very exploratory mode or exploitatory mode, right? So they may seem more open to experience in one case and more close to new experience in other cases. It's the same person, but just different state. Another issue is the dissociative identity disorder in psychiatry, where people might have multiple personalities. So this is interesting, and also you see it in bipolar disorder, where the same brain can have different states very radically, right? So somebody can be open or closed very differently depending on their clinical state. Another thing is that it's very hard to find personality if you just scan a person in a magnet and find this person is cheap and this person is generous. Everything else is completely equal about them. Put them in the magnet and you won't be able to measure this personality so easily. So we think that state is something that, you know, some kind of anchoring that you can look into. Okay, so this is about the disorders, but maybe it's less relevant here. Yeah, let me just feel like I've said everything already in these slides or most of it. So let me just go to the summary. Then the mind is not fixed. The same individual can demonstrate striking variability in her cognitive, affective, and behavioral tendencies under different contexts. Perception, attention, thought, affect, and behavioral inclination change in tandem and could be explained by an overarching state of mind. We propose a unifying principle for the cortical mechanism underlying this phenomenon of an overarching state of mind, whereby state of mind is determined by the ratio between top-down and bottom-up processing. This novel perspective is relevant to biology, neuroscience, and psychiatry, and I definitely think it's relevant in AI. Okay, so I just like to, okay, before I finish here, so think about the state of mind, just reiterating as a package here. So we have one thing change, all the other things change along in the same direction. So perceiving, attending, and thinking broadly, better mood, open to experience and exploration, thrilled by uncertainty, creative and curious means you're more bottom up, right? So when you're more bottom up oriented, all this package comes together. Whereas if you're more top down, then you're more exploitatory, consuming the world locally and narrowly, less positive mood, less tolerant for uncertainty, and preferring the familiar. Okay? Things I've said before already, but I think it's important to emphasize that these things come in a package, so it's all together. This is your state. And finally, I'd like to thank my lab, and especially Noah Hertz, who was the postdoc who worked with me on this. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them now.
Thanks, Moshe. Time for a few questions. You can unmute yourself and ask question. You can raise hand as well, or you can put on chat. And meanwhile, yes, Ivy.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'd like to ask a question. I want to understand like more in detail, like what are the applications in industry right now? So can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah. Um, People ask me about, what was the last time I gave a talk somewhere in the US? It was also AI or computer science people, and we talked about robotics. And you think about, I'm not a technologist per se, but I have my inclinations because of my background studies, but I do think sometimes about, think about a robot that needs to learn, but you don't want it to learn if their existence is in danger, right? So if there's an environment where you want the robot just to get out of there as quickly as possible, this is not a good state for them to start learning and looking under tables and learning new information and seeking new statistical regularities or whatever. So this means that we have to build more dynamic systems that their biases and their tendencies have to be state dependent. So in some states, we want to be more exploratory or want to be more creative. Your agent should look for original solutions in some circumstances or the mundane solution, but they're faster in some other cases. Okay, so this is one application where I think that you can take these things and think about. I mean, I remember discussions I had with, I won't mention them, big computer science company, the computer company that we had a joint DARPA grant together. And I kept criticizing them for not taking top-down, bottom-up, top-down information, there's feedback information, more seriously into how they do things. And they, it's like, you tell us how to do this, because, and I realized that, even just taking one dimension of what I said here is not trivial. I mean, just to what extent we take top-down, when do we take our previous knowledge and merge it into our perception? When do you want your computer vision or your seeing agent, artificial agent, to say, okay, this is a familiar environment. I'm just going to lean on my predictions of everything I know, and then be more prone to surprises and be able to actually not detect things just because this agent leaned on previous information, versus say, okay, disconnect from everything you know as an agent and just treat everything as new, like my Varanasi example, or any example where you fall into an environment that's completely new, right? So do you want your robot to project an approximation of familiarity to a new environment just so that it can feel like it can manage, it can navigate, it can prosper, or detect, this is a state where I want to learn, versus this is a state where I want to minimize prediction error and just follow a familiar path. So these are some places where technology can actually take these ideas into play.
All right, Karen?
Hi. Yeah, thank you for the talk. It's very, very interesting. I like what we made one comment and one question. The comment is that from your framework, if you apply to the development of psychology, and does it mean that the kids are more likely to be happy than adults because they don't have, most likely they take the bottom-up approach because they don't have something imposed, right?
I think it's a great question. I will be bold enough to say that I do claim that kids, by and large, you can't generalize, and it's not always the case. But if you look at average mood for kids, not in underprivileged areas or like, Western world kids, I think are on average more happy or in more positive mood than adults. And there are different, I have a whole talk about mood, and there I talk about kids, and it has to do with a less developed prefrontal cortex and less experience. Everything is evoking curiosity, and their creativity is much higher typically. So it all comes together. So story with kids, I think, is highly supportive of these ideas.
Yeah, and also remind me another survey that people talk about the satisfaction and not necessarily related to happiness, that people after retire, they're getting happier. And this is kind of contradictory to your framework.
So first of all, I actually just came across a New Yorker article that actually I think is from 2016. I'm very behind on my New Yorker issues. So there was a long article there questioning this positive aging hypothesis. So I know it's common and many of us want to be optimistic that in older age we're all happier. I'm taking this with a grain of salt. I don't have evidence, but this article cited a lot of books and articles and scientific evidence that this is very limited in terms of context. But even if it were proven to be, airtight proposal that all of us will get happier as we get older, I don't see this contradicting. I mean, it's I don't know, why would you think it's contradicting? What do you see about older people that goes in the opposite direction, but still, I mean, they're not more ruminative or more,
Well, or in general compared to kids, but this is a little off topic.
Yeah, I see what you
Yeah.
yeah.
Another question I'd like to ask is about the measurement. So I probably have to read your paper. So you talk about the, basically you want to claim that the state of mind are changing all the time, right? In order to, detect it accurately, we need to have a kind of non-invasive continuous measurement.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on any of this? Even there was a dimension you mentioned, and do they already have a validated instrument or continuously that we can measure?
So,
or is it still on the development?
You're asking about whether we have
yeah, for example, the instrument to measure the thought, the associative versus ruminative. You cannot ask the question to the individual again, right? It's like.
So you're asking if we have a way to measure state of mind?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a bunch, yes. We have a few and still, and a few are still being developed. So it's not, we don't have like a single metric to do this, but the idea here is that if we claim that all these things tie together, we can look at how globally versus locally oriented is your attention. This is basic psychophysical tests, okay? If in this big S that is made out of F's, you'll more quickly say F, the little one, versus the S. Then I can infer that in your state right now, you're more oriented to the details. Then I can measure your mood. I can measure the scope of your thoughts, right? So a lot of what we do in the lab now is kind of cross-examine all these dimensions and see if we can really prove that they move together. And each of these dimensions, each of these individual dimensions, we have established measures that have been established before I became a scientist even, that we can use them to deduce a state in each of the dimensions. Then we have to see if the other dimensions agree.
Great, thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, there's one last question.
Hi, thank you for the nice talk. There was a speaker 2 weeks ago, Timnit Gebru, and she was talking about underrepresented minorities. And she mentioned companies who do interviews on job applicants. These companies work for other companies, and they record the interview and tell the hiring company about the personality of this person. And I have two questions. How do the SOM and top-down, bottom-up influence the person who is an underrepresented minority, so they are in a more stress situation? And how could tests of personality take into account these biases as which are also overarching regulators, I assume. I'm not in this field, but I found your points very interesting.
Thank you. These are two great questions. So I'm not sure I agree that underrepresented minorities are always in a stress or always in negative. So I don't think that they're always depressed or always feel underrepresented or always feel stressed. So I'm just saying this to highlight the fact that they actually fluctuate, their state fluctuates. So like everybody else who's even overrepresented, a majority, right? Even if you're wealthy, happy, you have everything in your life that everybody envies you, still you have ups and downs. And these ups and downs, not only in mood, you can sometimes look for your keys, right? So you become local and you think very locally. You also think locally, you perceive locally, and but I don't want to say that you become exploitatory, because you're looking for your keys, you know, it lasts for 2 minutes and that's it. So I'm not saying it changes your state of mind, but I'm just saying that things can change, like external and internal methods, as I said before. External and internal signals can change your state, and it doesn't matter who you are and where you're from. You can say that a depressed person tends to spend more time in one end of this. Here you see here. So a depressed person might be more gravitating towards, so more often spending time here. So most of us, or most of the neurotypical people are somewhere here, and they kind of go back and forth between top down, bottom up. But different disorders or different states, like not state of mind, but being underrepresented or being stressed or being really poor or being abused, you might be being spending time more in one end versus the other. Your other question is, I think, even more important and should be taken into account, is that when you measure personality, just like I said about subjects who come to our lab, you need to sample the multiple points. So if I interview you to a job, you behave and I characterize your personality on this 25 minutes or 30 or 50 minutes, whatever interview we have, I need to keep in mind you're in a certain state now, okay? And a person that might seem risk averse in the morning might be actually thrill seeker in the evening, because they're in different state. So I think personality measurements in the future, once they take these ideas into account, we'll have to average measurements such that, or at least take into account your state when they do this. And one thing we do in the lab is actually induce a state. I didn't talk about this, but we are actually often like to induce a certain state, so we know what state you're in. Rather than ask you, are you sad? Are you happy? Did you just get good news? Are you thinking locally? Are you thinking globally? Just before the test, the psychophysical test or any behavioral test we do in the lab, we run you through a battery of tests. Not everything is finished yet, so this is work under construction. That we puts you in a state that we know where you are now. With some, to some degree. And now we know we put you in a happy mood, in a global thinking or whatever. So all our subjects are relatively close in their state, so close to each other. So it has to be taken into account, yes.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, let's thank our speaker. Thanks, Moshe, for the wonderful time and
My pleasure.
talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Bye-bye. Okay.